Hi, guys. Welcome back to part three of the 1950s. And so I'm going to start this part with talking about the origins of Vietnam. And you're probably wondering, like, okay, I thought Vietnam was in the 60s and 70s. Why are we talking about it in the 50s? Because we have to talk about what happens here in order to really understand what happens during the Vietnam War. And I'm warning you now, it's kind of messy, so make sure you take some notes. So, in order to really understand the origins of the Vietnam War, we have to go back to World War II. So, in World War II, Indochina, which was previously part of a French, or was previously like a French colony, Indochina is occupied by the Japanese. Well, during World War II, we are also fighting the Japanese. Remember, we declared war on the Japanese after the bombing at Pearl Harbor, okay? So in 1941, the Viet Minh, which was a nationalist movement led by Ho Chi Minh, who was communist, launched guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. Now, because they were fighting the Japanese, whom we were also fighting, he got US support. So during World War II, surprisingly, we will, in a way, support a communist led fight because they're fighting the Japanese. In 1945 in Vietnam, they undergo something called the August Revolution, in which the Viet Minh gain control of North Vietnam. Okay, so you have the communists in North Vietnam and a more US aligned government in the South. In 1947, the Japanese were expelled from Vietnam. However, once the Japanese are expelled, the French wanted to retake their colony. Ho Chi Minh, under pressure from the Soviet Union, tried to negotiate with the French. However, the French ended up forcibly taking Hanoi, which again is in Vietnam. Once they forcibly take Hanoi, that starts the first Indochina War, with Chinese giving weapons and support to Ho Chi Minh, who are also communists. Now, what about where does the US fall during the first Indochina War? The US will support the French instead of Ho Chi Minh, who they supported during World War II. Okay? Now, Eisenhower will send billions of dollars in aid to support the French. However, they won't send military troops, but they will send billions of dollars in aid to support the French, whereas Ho Chi Minh is getting support from communists in China. Okay, or from communist China rather. So let's talk about the origins of Vietnam itself. So in the north, you have the Viet Minh who are communist. And in the south, you have No Dinh Diem who is anti-communist. I wouldn't even call him democratic. He's not democratic, but we'll go back to him. In the north, you have the Viet Minh who are communist. And so during the first Indochina War, they are supported by the communist Chinese who will end up funneling weapons into North Vietnam during the first Indochina War. And remember, the Viet Minh were initially supported by the US in World War II when the US was also fighting the Japanese. Now in the South, you have No Din Diem. Now, Diem is anti-communist, but I wouldn't call him democratic by any means, right? So in 1945, just for a little background, in 1945, Diem was actually captured by Ho Chi Minh's forces, and they essentially asked him to join the Viet Minh because Diem was Roman Catholic, and his family had been Roman Catholic. They were part of some of the first Vietnamese to convert to Roman Catholic, and so Ho Chi Minh hoped that by bringing Diem into his regime, that they would help to get the support, or they would get more Catholics to support Ho Chi Minh. However, Diem refuses. And in 1954, he served as prime minister of a US backed government. And however, he will eventually make himself president of South Vietnam. In 1955, Diem will have a campaign called the Denounce the Communist campaign, where he will jail communists, he will execute a number of communists. Diem was Catholic, and his Catholic leanings, or in his Catholic leanings, he did not have much tolerance. Now, South Vietnam at this point is majority Buddhist, but he did not have any tolerance for Buddhists. And so Diem will commit, I would say, Buddhist purges. It's he'll commit Buddhist purges where he will kill Buddhists, he will jail Buddhists as well. However, even though all of this is happening, the US will still support Diem because at the end of the day, Diem is anti-communist and our policy is of containment. We want to contain communism. We don't want communism to spread. So even though Diem is not democratic, even though Diem has at this point killed up to 12,000 people, he has jailed more than 40,000 people, he has committed, I'll call it religious purges, the US will still support Diem. Okay? So keep that in your notes because it's really important to understand that when we actually get to the Vietnam War. Okay, so now I am going to shift to the last part of the chapter, which has to do with the origins of the freedom movement. So, there are some things that I want you guys to understand in order to gain some context. Yes, we'll talk about the bus boycott. Yes, I will be talking about Martin Luther King Jr., but I also want to bring some other things or bring some other things to light so you guys will get a different view of it. So, in the 1950s, in the midst of this affluent society, in the midst of this consumer society that is fighting communism, it's still incredibly segregated. There are two different Americas where you have the America that white people are able to experience and the America that Black people and Brown people are able to experience. And these Americas are very, very different. Jim Crow is very, very prevalent in the South. In 1950, about 40% of American school children studied in legally segregated schools. And at the beginning of this semester, I taught you guys about the difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. And really, I wanted to drill that in your mind because it really comes to importance now. De jure segregation is segregation that is enforced by the law. De facto segregation, on the other hand, is segregation that is by habit or by custom. So you will start to see the importance, or I will say the impact of both de jure and de facto segregation. It's in the 1950s that many people and many organizations will begin to fight de jure segregation. Okay? So, the League of Latin American Citizens, also known as LULAC, will challenge restrictive housing, they'll challenge employment discrimination, as well as segregation of Latino students in America's public schools. LULAC, like the NAACP, will take this fight to the courts. They'll take it to the Supreme Court. And one very famous court case that is decided in 1946 is called Mendez versus Westminster. Mendez versus Westminster. And in this case, Orange County public schools were ordered to desegregate. Now, like LULAC, the NAACP will also start to challenge this idea of separate but equal, right? And so, in one case, the case of Sweat versus Painter, it talks about, or Sweat versus Painter is really about, concerns rather, a student who named Heman Sweat, a black student who wanted admission to the University of Texas Law School. And he was denied admittance to the University of Texas Law School based on his race. And so in Sweat versus Painter, which was decided in 1950, the Supreme Court ordered Heman Sweat to be admitted to the University of Texas Law School. Going back to LULAC, I forgot to mention, LULAC was founded in 1927 in Corpus Christi, Texas, by Latino World War I veterans. So that's very, very important to recognize that LULAC was founded by individuals who fought for a nation that didn't necessarily fight for them. And so they would challenge separate but equal in a number of court cases, such as Mendez versus Westminster. Now, a case that many people have heard about is the Brown case, or Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This court case was argued by Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to become the first Black Supreme Court justice in the United States. So, in this case, which ordered the desegregation of all U.S. public schools, Marshall argued that segregation in and of itself was inherently unequal. He argued that separate but equal was just simply not true, that you could not have separate but equal. Marshall argued that segregation was inherently unequal because it stigmatized one group of citizens as being unfit to associate with the other group of citizens. And so in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, it was decided in 1954, and it desegregated, or ordered rather, the desegregation of all U.S. public schools. And you would think, wow, once that happened by 1955, all public schools were desegregated. No, many states will fight this desegregation, or this rule of desegregation, in many ways. This is why de facto segregation is so important. Even though the Brown case was argued, or decided rather, in 1954, my mom graduated high school in the 1970s here in Texas, and she graduated from an all Black high school. In her town, even in the 70s, there was a Black high school and a white high school because of de facto segregation, which is segregation that is just by habit or by custom. Now, many states will react to the Brown decision in different ways. Now, one, the Brown decision did not give a specified time period for when these schools are to desegregate. Instead, it said to just do so with all deliberate speed. And since there was no time period, they just kind of took their time. Some schools would actually shut down. A school district in Virginia closed all of their schools in order to prevent desegregation, or the integration of the schools. So instead of having white students go to school with Black students, they would rather just have their students not learn at all. So it was not happily received. If you want to know how people reacted to desegregation, I admonish you guys to go to YouTube or go to Google and just look up the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine has to do with a group of 9 students who desegregated the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so just look at the Little Rock Nine if you want to see how states handle desegregation. In the 1950s, it's also, I would say, I don't even know if we could call this a nadir in race relations, because I would definitely say that post Reconstruction, we would see a definite nadir or a low point in race relations. However, in the 1950s, things had not really improved that much for African Americans. So, of course, yes, I'm going to talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, but to provide some context also for the boycott begins on December 1st, 1955. However, in August of that year, a young Black boy who lived in Chicago decided to, his mom sent him down to Mississippi to visit his family for the summer. One day, when he and his cousins are out and they go to a store, he allegedly whistles at the woman whose family owns the shop. Her name was Carolyn Bryant. When this happens, he goes, his cousins allegedly are like, you're not supposed to say or do things like that, because, of course, in the South, there is a very elaborate social construct that you have to follow. Um, he goes home to his family's home, and in the middle of the night, grown white men, get him out of his bed. His family is not able to help him, and they never see him alive again. They beat him. They beat him to death, literally, and then tied him to a gin fan and threw him in the river. And a few days later, his body washes up on the shores of the river. That young boy's name, this young teenager's name, is Emmett Till. And Emmett Till, the murder of Emmett Till, I would say, really helps to begin the civil rights movement. It's not that he was the first person to be killed, it was that the manner in which he was killed and his age and the publicity. His mother, even though this child was horribly bloated, he was horribly disfigured, he was unrecognizable. His mother decided to have an open casket funeral so the world could see what they did to her son. So that happens in the summer. And then in the winter of 1955, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And she refused to surrender her seat to a white rider when she is asked to do so. And so Parks is arrested. Was Rosa Parks the first woman to refuse, or the first person to refuse to give up her seat? No, as a matter of fact, a young woman by the name of Claudette Colvin had done the same thing prior. However, Rosa Parks is, well, I won't get into this class. Rosa Parks, I would say, is essentially chosen to be the one to do this. Once she refuses to give up her seat, it sparks the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott was a boycott of city buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And so instead of riding the bus, Black riders would walk to work. They formed an informal network of taxis, and the boycott will last for over a year. It lasted for 381 days. At the end of the boycott, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation and public transportation was unconstitutional. And so that is a victory, right? Now, what people don't often talk about is what happened to Rosa Parks and her husband after the Montgomery bus boycott. It's not that like she went into this life of fame. Her and her husband were essentially forced out of Montgomery. They ended up moving to Detroit because they couldn't get a job in Montgomery anymore. So this sacrifice that she made was not just a sacrifice for the movement, but it ended up being a very personal economic sacrifice for her and her family. It's also during this time that a young 20-something-year-old minister by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. bursts into the scene. It's really the Montgomery bus boycott that launched racial justice or launched the racial justice movement as a nonviolent crusade. And this crusade is based in Black churches in the South. That's why the Black church is of such grave importance, not just during Reconstruction, but even in times after enslavement and after Reconstruction. The church served as a meeting place. It served as a place of political participation. And so it's really this movement is based in Black churches throughout the South. Martin Luther King Jr. really emerges from this movement. And when he begins, he is only in his 20s. Now, Martin Luther King will appeal to a deep sense of injustice among Blacks, and he will really try to appeal to the conscience of whites. He will also invoke the Bible to preach justice and nonviolence and forgiveness. And he believed in peaceful civil disobedience. Martin Luther King's message, however, the older he becomes and the more he sees, especially as it concerns issues in the 1960s, his language will definitely change. And that's something that I will address for the sake of time. I'll definitely address that in the next chapter. In 1956, King takes the lead in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or the SCLC. Okay, the SCLC. The SCLC was a coalition of Black ministers and civil rights activists, and they pressed for desegregation. Now, despite the Brown decision, which desegregated public schools in 1954, states began to pass their own laws to block desegregation. So that school, remember I was telling you guys about Virginia? Prince Edward County, Virginia, they actually shut down all of their schools in 1959 to prevent desegregation. Okay, so in the next chapter, when we're talking about the 1960s, we will really get. Oh my goodness, we will get some great information. Also, if you want to learn more about Martin Luther King and not just the Martin Luther King that is often on your textbooks or in your textbooks, right? You want to learn about the more radical Martin Luther King, please send me an email. I have suggestions on documentaries and books for you guys, so please just hit me up in my email. All right. So the last thing we'll talk about today is the election of 1960, which is Kennedy versus Nixon. So Republicans chose Vice President Richard Nixon as their candidate, and Democrats nominated John F. Kennedy as their candidate. And Kennedy was a young senator from Massachusetts. He won by a narrow margin. And Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas accepted Kennedy's offer to run for vice president. So Kennedy won, and Johnson was the VP. One of the reasons that many people kind of posit or theorize that Nixon lost is because they had debates on TV. And Nixon at this time was recovering from a flu. And so you see him with stubble, you see him sweating, and the public didn't know that he was recovering from a flu. And so you see this stubbly, sweating man, and you assume that he's nervous or that he's lying about what he's talking about. But really, it's that he was sick. But it's really that debate that helped to seal Kennedy's victory. And again, it was by a very, very narrow margin. And so that's the election of 1960. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the 1960s. I'll go a little deeper into the civil rights movement. I'll also go into the Black Power movement as well, and maybe a little bit of Pan Africanism. All right. So I will see you guys next time for chapter 25. All right. Thank you.